The rain had just started to fall when I merged onto Interstate 84, the sky smudged with gray and the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. My hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as I glanced at the time on the dashboard. 6:17 p.m. I was supposed to pick up a VIP client from the airport in less than an hour, and traffic was already turning into a sea of red brake lights. I adjusted my Bluetooth headset and sighed. Just another long Tuesday in Portland. My name is Evelyn Harper, and I was the kind of person who got things done. I handled logistics, put out fires, made things happen. No drama, no excuses. I was a project manager at an architecture firm, the person you called when something fell apart. But no one expects to fall apart themselves. Not until it happens. The crash came out of nowhere. One moment I was slowing for a red light, and the next there was a scream of tires and the blinding glare of headlights cutting across my lane. A truck had run the light. It slammed into the driver's side with the force of a freight train. Metal folded, glass exploded, my body whipped sideways, and then everything went black. I woke up to chaos, sirens, shouting, rain soaking my legs through the shattered door. My mouth tasted like pennies. Pain burned through my side. I tried to move and screamed. Someone was beside me now, a paramedic. He said something about a compound fracture, internal bleeding. Another voice called out that I had a pulse. They slid me onto a stretcher and strapped my neck into place. I caught a glimpse of flashing red lights and twisted metal before the ambulance doors slammed shut. The ride was a blur. The siren wailed above me, drowning out the rush of blood in my ears. I drifted in and out. Every breath felt like a knife in my ribs. I could hear one of the EMTs saying my blood pressure was dropping. My leg was shattered. I could feel nothing but fire and ice alternating with every heartbeat. But none of it compared to what came next. That moment would be the one I remembered most. The emergency room was bright and sterile, lit by flickering fluorescent lights that made everything feel detached and unreal. A nurse asked me my name, my age, if I knew what day it was. I whispered answers through clenched teeth. I wanted to scream but couldn't find the air. They were talking about surgery, internal bleeding, a collapsed lung. My hands fumbled for my phone. It had been in the inside pocket of my coat. The screen was cracked but still worked. With trembling fingers, I opened my contacts. There was only one person I knew to call. My emergency contact. Dad. The man who had always said family comes first. The man who had raised me after Mom passed. The man I still believed would drop everything if I was in trouble. I hit the call button. It rang. Once, twice, voicemail. I hung up and called again. This time he picked up. His voice came through clipped and impatient. Evelyn, what is it? I'm in the middle of something. It was Amber again, wasn't it? Of course it was Amber. I could hear her in the background, crying, yelling, the same song and dance. I swallowed and forced my voice to steady. Dad, I'm at the hospital. I was in a car accident. I can't feel my leg. They think I might need surgery. There was a long pause, then a sigh. Not one of worry, one of annoyance. Are you dying, Evelyn? Because Amber is having a complete meltdown. She just got rejected from the final round of auditions for that acting gig she really wanted. She's spiraling. I'm trying to keep her together. This is not the time for drama. My heart dropped into the pit of my stomach. The pain in my chest was no longer just from the crash. Dad, I whispered. I'm alone. They're talking about internal bleeding. He didn't respond. I heard Amber sobbing in the background. Then his voice again. You're strong. You'll be fine. Don't call in a panic. Amber needs me now. Then he hung up. I stared at the screen until it went black in my hand. Everything around me faded. The beep of machines, the nurse adjusting my IV. It was all background noise. My father had just told me in the most brutal way possible that I didn't matter. Not compared to Amber, not even when my life was on the line. I closed my eyes and felt something break inside. Not a bone, not a muscle. Something deeper, something that had held on for too long. That moment wasn't just the aftermath of a crash, it was the fracture that changed everything. Lying under the glare of the ER lights with machines beeping steadily around me and pain radiating through every limb, I stared at my phone like it was a foreign object. The call had ended. No, that wasn't even the word for it. He had ended it. My father, Daniel Harper, had hung up on me while I lay strapped to a hospital gurney, barely breathing, bones broken, blood drying on my lips. Because my sister Amber was having a meltdown. Because she didn't get the part she wanted in some regional production of Macbeth. Because her disappointment somehow trumped my critical injuries. I blinked hard, trying to process it. There had always been imbalances in our family, but I had convinced myself they were small, forgivable, circumstantial. Maybe Dad was just overwhelmed. Maybe Amber really was fragile. Maybe I was just stronger. But in that moment, all those excuses fell apart like wet paper. I could barely move, and yet I still felt the sharpest pain of all, not in my ribs, but in my heart. The nurse returned with pain meds. She asked gently if someone was on their way. I nodded without thinking, the lie rolling off my tongue before I even knew I had said it. The truth was too pathetic to voice. I didn't want her to know I had no one. Not really. I closed my eyes and tried to breathe, tried to calm the shaking in my hands. I told myself he would come. Maybe in an hour, maybe after Amber settled down, maybe when he realized what he'd done. But as time ticked on and the machines continued their steady rhythm, that hope began to rot. He wasn't coming. I knew it. And it wasn't even shocking. That's what made it hurt worse. It felt familiar. Too familiar. The realization unfurled slowly but relentlessly like a storm cloud swallowing the sky. This wasn't the first time I had been put second, or third, or nowhere at all. Amber had always been the emotional one, the one who cried at loud noises, who broke down over failed friendships, who needed more. And I had always been the solution. The quiet child, the responsible one, the fixer. Dad used to call me his little rock. At 10 years old, I thought it was a compliment. At 28, lying in a hospital bed abandoned, I knew it was a burden disguised as praise. I remembered a time when Amber lost her voice before a recital and Dad left my piano solo unrecorded to sit with her backstage. I remembered birthdays where she got cake and sparklers and friends while I got polite dinners and a card that said, "You're so dependable." I remembered junior year when Amber dropped out of college and moved back home, and Dad gave her my old room, forcing me to crash on the couch when I visited for holidays. Because she's going through something, Evelyn, and I wasn't, because I never was. That's how they saw me. Steady, unbreakable. But I was breaking now, and no one seemed to notice. Or care. In the stillness of the trauma ward, I watched other patients receive visitors. Mothers holding hands. Husbands reading aloud from books. Siblings setting up phone chargers and fluffy socks. I had no one. Not because I didn't have family, but because my family didn't see me unless I was useful. I was no longer useful. I was wounded, needy, an inconvenience. And Amber got compassion for rejection. I got dismissed for bleeding. It was that simple. I started scrolling through my messages looking for something to hold on to. Maybe a voicemail. Maybe an old picture. Anything to ground me. But all I found were receipts. Literal receipts. Transfers of money I had sent to Amber over the years. Payments for therapy. For rent. For that car she crashed and needed fixed. Dad had asked me to help just until she gets back on her feet. She never did. She never had to. Because people like me kept holding her up. I stared at the cracked phone screen, fury and grief mixing in my chest like acid. I thought of the time I pawned my laptop to pay rent while Amber was gifted a new iPad because she felt creatively stifled. I thought of how Dad had driven 6 hours to comfort her after a breakup, but texted me when I got promoted with a single word, "Congrats." And now, this. This moment in the ER, this fracture in my body and soul. It wasn't an accident. Not just the crash, but all of it. This was the consequence of a lifetime spent performing strength for people who only valued me when I didn't ask for anything. And now, I had asked. Not for money, not for praise, just for presence. And I was told point blank that Amber needed him more. That I was being dramatic, that I would be fine. The words echoed in my skull. "You're strong. You'll be fine. Don't call in a panic. Amber needs me now. I wanted to scream, to rip out the IVs and throw the phone across the room. But I was too tired, too broken. Instead, I pressed the phone to my chest and let the tears come. Not loud sobs, just silent, steady drops that slid down my temples into my hair. I wasn't crying because I was weak. I was crying because I had been strong for too damn long. Because I had played the role they needed me to play until I no longer recognized myself. Because I had believed that if I kept giving, kept waiting, kept proving myself one day, it would be my turn. But that turn never came, and maybe it never would, unless I made it happen. The night settled over the hospital like a heavy blanket thick with antiseptic and silence. Machines hummed, footsteps echoed faintly in the hallway, but inside my room it was just me and the slow drip of fluids keeping me steady. I stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from the hallway lights dance across the tiles. The painkillers dulled my body, but not my thoughts. Those raced with a clarity I had never allowed myself to feel. I wasn't just hurting because of the accident. I was hurting because of everything that had led up to it. The accident was a spark, but the fuel had been there for years, layered over time like old wallpaper each sheet. Another moment I swallowed. Disappointment minimized my needs, played the role of the strong daughter, while Amber got the spotlight for simply surviving herself. I thought back to my 13th birthday when Dad forgot to pick up the cake because Amber had been crying all morning about not having friends. He said we could just make one at home, and we did burned on the edges, too sweet in the center, with her name iced on it because she felt left out. I remembered my college graduation where I searched the audience from the stage, scanning for him, only to find out later he had driven Amber to a last-minute audition. He sent flowers 2 days later with a card that read, "Proud of you, kiddo." I had read that card 100 times, squeezing pride from it like water from a stone. Even then, I had tried to understand. Tried to be gracious. After all, she struggled. She needed him more. That's what I told myself. That was the script. Amber was the delicate one, the emotional artist, the wild spirit crushed by the world's weight. I was the capable one, the steady ground she stood on. They needed me to be strong so they could fall apart. But as I lay in that hospital bed, body immobilized, I began to understand the full cost of that role. I had been erased. Not physically, not by accident, but systematically, emotionally, again and again. Every time Amber cried and Dad ran to her, I disappeared a little more. Every time I made my own doctor's appointments, paid my own rent, fought my own battles, I taught them I didn't need them. And because they thought I didn't need them, they never came. Even now, when I was at my most vulnerable, they were nowhere. My phone stayed silent. No follow-up, no message, no check-in to see if I was still alive. The hospital staff thought someone was coming. I had nodded earlier. I didn't know how to take it back now. I just kept waiting, watching the door, hoping it would open. But it didn't. And something inside me hardened. This wasn't a family dynamic. It was a transaction. My worth was measured by what I could absorb. The more I took on, the more I faded. And Amber thrived in that vacuum. She demanded attention and she received it. She failed upward, and still they praised her courage. When she dropped out of community college for the second time, Dad took her to Sedona for a soul-healing retreat. When I got promoted to senior project manager, he liked my LinkedIn post but never called. She was the center of the story. I was just the page it was written on. I used to tell myself that being the strong one was a compliment, that Dad relied on me because he trusted me, that Amber needed more because life had been harder on her. But that night, I finally let the truth sink in. They didn't see me. Not really. They saw what I did, what I gave. And they loved that version of me, the one who never asked for more, who filled the gaps, who picked up the slack. Not because they valued me, but because it was convenient. I had trained them to ignore my needs by never voicing them. I had taught them that I would always say yes, always step aside, always sacrifice without complaint. That was my prison built from my own silence. And now, here I was, broken, bleeding, utterly alone, because I had been too good at disappearing. A nurse walked in quietly, checking my vitals, adjusting my blanket. She looked at the empty chair beside my bed and asked gently, Is anyone else coming tonight? I opened my mouth and closed it again. Then I shook my head. No, I said. Just me. She didn't press. Just nodded and touched my arm lightly before slipping out. But something about her question lingered. It was the first time anyone had asked me that without assuming I had someone. And in that space, that honest space, I felt something new, the urge to protect myself. Not from the pain. I could handle pain, I always had. But from the people who watched me hurt and called it strength. From the ones who expected me to be okay with being overlooked. From the father who dismissed my cries because Amber needed him more. From the sister who devoured attention like oxygen and left nothing for anyone else. I reached for my phone again, my hand steadier now. I didn't scroll to Dad, not Amber either. I scrolled past them down to the contact list until I found a name I hadn't seen in a long time. Georgia Lynn. My lawyer. We had worked together years ago when I bought my townhouse. She was sharp, discreet, and most importantly, she never made me feel small. I tapped her number and waited. When she answered, her voice was calm, steady, just like I remembered. Evelyn, are you okay? I swallowed hard. I'm in the hospital. Car accident. Physically, I'll recover, but I need help. Legal help. She asked no questions, just listened. I explained everything. The accident, the call, the history, the financial support I'd given over the years, the emotional void, the realization that I had been giving and giving, hoping to earn something that was never going to be returned. Her voice didn't waver. Okay, she said. What do you want to do? I want to cut them off, I said. The words felt terrifying and free. I want to remove Dad and Amber from everything. Power of attorney, financial access, will, emergency contact, all of it. I want out. I want protection. She was quiet for a beat, then said, I understand. I'll be there in the morning. We'll take care of everything. You don't have to do this alone. As I hung up, the machines beside me beeped softly. My breath slowed. My hands unclenched. For the first time in my life, I wasn't trying to prove anything. I wasn't waiting to be seen. I was choosing to see myself, not as the strong one, but as someone who deserved to be held too. Someone worth showing up for, even if that meant doing it alone. The next morning arrived without fanfare, just the dull light of dawn filtering through half-closed blinds and the soft rustle of hospital linens as the nurse changed my IV bag. My body ached in ways I had never known, but my mind felt sharper, clearer, anchored by a decision I hadn't known I needed to make until it was already made. I wasn't waiting for my father anymore. I wasn't checking my phone for apologies that would never come. I wasn't hoping Amber would suddenly wake up to the wreckage she'd helped create. No, I was done hoping. I was acting now. At precisely 9:04 a.m., Georgia Lynn walked into my hospital room like a storm in a tailored Navy suit. Her dark hair was pulled back, her expression unreadable, and in her hand was a leather case that held the power I had been denied for years. She didn't ask how I was feeling. She didn't offer small talk. She sat beside my bed, opened her laptop, and said, "Let's get started." I handed her the flash drive I'd hidden in my overnight bag, the one filled with records I hadn't even realized I'd been collecting over the years. Bank statements, PayPal logs, emails, even text screenshots. I had always felt the need to document to track every dollar that left my account at the request of either my father or my sister, as if some part of me had known I'd eventually need proof. Georgia plugged it in, and her fingers flew across the keyboard, sorting, calculating, categorizing. She asked concise questions. I gave her names, dates, context. When she turned the screen toward me, the number at the bottom made my stomach tighten. $97,214. That's how much I had given them over the last 5.5 years. Rent for Amber's studio apartment after she had a panic attack and couldn't work. A new set of tires when Dad's car failed inspection, but he didn't want to dip into his own savings. Therapy copays, grocery reimbursements, a medical bill from Amber's emergency room visit for what turned out to be indigestion, but she insisted felt like death. Georgia didn't flinch. "This isn't generosity," she said. "This is a pattern, a cycle of financial dependence wrapped in emotional manipulation." And you, Evelyn, have been the engine keeping it running. I felt something splinter under my ribs, not a bone this time, but a belief. A belief that my sacrifices had meaning, that giving so much would eventually earn me love or respect or even just recognition. Instead, I had taught them that I would never say no. Until now. Georgia guided me through every step. We revoked the power of attorney I had signed years ago, back when I thought giving Dad legal access to my affairs was a gesture of trust. We removed both Dad and Amber as beneficiaries from my will. We shut down their access to my health directives. Every document I signed felt like shedding a layer of old skin, dry and cracked, and no longer mine. I wasn't just taking my money back. I was reclaiming my voice, my space, my right to exist without being bled dry. At one point, Georgia looked up and asked if I was sure, if I wanted to notify them now or wait until I was out of the hospital. I told her to do it today. Let them know. Let the silence end. Let the illusion break. She nodded and composed a message crisp and professional. She would handle all communications. I didn't have to explain myself. I didn't owe them an emotional translation. My boundary would speak for itself, and it did. Within hours, she had confirmation that the documents had been served. I was no longer a lifeline. I was a closed door, and for the first time that didn't make me feel cruel. It made me feel free. There was no scene, no screaming match, just signatures, dates, and legal clarity. Georgia closed her laptop, packed her files, and stood. "You did the hard part," she said. "The rest is logistics." She left with a promise to follow up in 2 days. The nurse came in shortly after to check my vitals. She noticed the papers on my tray and smiled. Not nosy, just kind. "You look lighter," she said. And strangely I was. Not healed. Not yet. But lighter. Because for once, I had chosen myself. Not in spite of my family, but because I had finally realized they were not mine to carry. Not anymore. The air in the hospital room thickened as the afternoon crept in sunlight, pressing against the blinds, like it too wanted to witness what was coming. I lay still, the weight of fresh bandages wrapped tightly around my torso, a dull ache echoing in my fractured bones, but my mind was steady, anchored by a growing certainty. Georgia had stayed by my side after filing the final paperwork, sensing what I had not said aloud, that they would come, that my silence, my withdrawal, my sudden legal independence would not be met with understanding, but with outrage. People like them did not take rejection quietly, and she was right. At 4:47 p.m., sharp, the door to my room opened with a swift push, and in walked my father, Daniel Harper, in a wrinkled button-down shirt tie, askew as if he wanted to look disheveled enough to appear concerned, but not enough to ruin his image. Right behind him, Amber. Her designer sunglasses perched on top of her head, her lips pursed her eyes, already brimming with unshed performance tears. The moment their eyes landed on Georgia seated calmly beside my bed with a folder in hand, the air changed. My father's face darkened with suspicion. "Who is this?" he demanded, already pointing, as if accusation alone could displace the truth. Georgia stood slowly, her voice calm and firm. "I'm Georgia Lynn, Evelyn's attorney. My presence here is on her request." Amber scoffed, her voice rising. "An attorney? Are you serious, Evelyn? We're family. This is absurd." I pushed myself upright despite the pain clawing through my side. "Sit down if you want to talk or walk out. Your choice." Dad stepped forward, jaw clenched. "Is this about earlier, Evelyn? You can't be serious. You weren't dying. Amber was having a really bad episode. She needed support." "A job rejection isn't an episode," I said flatly, voice as cold as steel. "I was in a car crash. I had internal bleeding. I was alone." Amber interjected, her voice high and trembling. "I was having a panic attack." "You're being cruel. You're twisting things." I turned to her, my eyes sharp. "No, I'm remembering them correctly. You were disappointed. I was in surgery prep. And, Dad, you hung up on me. You told me not to call in a panic because she needed you more. I could have died." My father's voice raised an octave, frustration boiling over. "You're being dramatic again. You always turn everything into a crisis." That line, That exact sentence, the one he'd used all my life to minimize my pain, the one he'd wielded to erase me while praising Amber for every tremble of emotion. Georgia, I said, never looking away from them, would you please play the message? She nodded, pulled out her phone, and tapped it twice. The room filled with the sound of his voice, sharp and dismissive through the speaker. Why are you making such a fuss? You're not dying. Don't call in a panic. Amber needs support urgently now. Then Amber's voice soft and snide. You're so self-centered, Evelyn. Can't you see I'm spiraling? The call ended in static. Silence followed, dense and undeniable. My father's mouth opened, but no words came. Amber looked pale, like someone had just thrown cold water on her carefully styled illusion. You recorded us? Dad asked, his voice now tinged with disbelief and fury. Yes, I replied calmly. After you hung up on me. Something told me I'd need proof when you started spinning the story. You've lost your mind, he said, stepping back. No, I said, finally steady. I've found it. Georgia stepped forward, papers in hand. As of today, Evelyn Harper has formally revoked all financial access and responsibilities toward either of you. This includes the prior power of attorney shared accounts and any legal or medical authorizations. You are no longer entitled to anything connected to her name or resources. My father grabbed the paper eyes, scanning furiously, face flushing red. You can't do this. She can, Georgia answered, and she has. Amber lurched forward, voice trembling. But I need help. I'm applying for new roles. I can't go back to Mom's basement. I looked at her, my voice even and unshaking. That's not my problem anymore. You've had years of lifelines. I was the one bleeding this time, and you still made it about you. My father's voice cracked. We're your family. No, I replied. You're my blood. That's not the same thing. He looked like he'd been slapped, stunned into silence. After everything I did for you, he whispered. You raised me to be responsible so I could carry your irresponsibility, I said. That's not parenting, that's dependency. Amber opened her mouth to speak again, but Georgia had already stepped toward the door. This conversation is over. I suggest you leave now. The door opened. My father stared at me, eyes wide, mouth trembling with words he couldn't form. Amber's expression folded into something sharp and cruel, but she stayed silent. And then just like that, they turned and walked out. Out of the room. Out of my space. Out of the version of my life that had kept them comfortably fed on my silence and compliance. The sound of the door closing behind them was not triumphant. It was not peaceful. It was heavy, like the moment after a hurricane when the winds die down, but the damage is just beginning to be understood. Georgia remained for a few minutes longer, organizing the signed documents and sliding them back into her folder. She looked at me not with pity, but with something firmer. They'll push back, she said softly. Emotionally, maybe even publicly. Be prepared for anger disguised as heartbreak. I nodded. I knew she was right, and still I had no regrets. For the first time, I had spoken without apologizing. I had drawn a line not out of spite, but out of survival. I was not their caretaker anymore. I was not their scapegoat or their savings account or their invisible shield. I was just Evelyn, and I was finally free. They didn't wait long. That same night, while the IV in my arm still fed antibiotics into my system and the ache in my ribs pulsed beneath thick layers of gauze, the first message came. It was from Amber. I can't believe you blindsided us like that. You've always been jealous. You wanted to humiliate me in front of Dad. You're not a victim. You just like playing one now that it gets you sympathy. A few minutes later came a text from my father. This is a betrayal after everything we did for you. I paid for your braces. I took you to summer camp. I was there for your childhood, and this is how you repay me. Each message arrived like a pebble against glass, small on its own, but constant, relentless threatening to shatter whatever fragile piece I had managed to carve out for myself. But I didn't respond. I remembered George's words. Silence is power. Let your attorney speak for you. Let your boundaries speak louder than any reply. So I muted their numbers. I let the buzzing phone slip into the drawer beside my bed, and I closed my eyes. Not to escape, but to rest. It didn't stop there. 2 days after I was discharged and returned home on crutches, I opened Facebook to see it. A vague post from my father, the kind that begged for sympathy without offering any facts. Sometimes the ones you love the most hurt you the deepest, especially when they forget where they came from. The comment section swelled with family, friends, and distant relatives offering support. "Hang in there, Dan. So sorry you're going through this. Prayers up." Then came the passive-aggressive dagger from Aunt Lisa. "We raised our kids better than that. Loyalty is everything." But what truly shook me wasn't the smear campaign. It was who stayed silent and who didn't. My cousin Tessa, who I hadn't spoken to since a family wedding 5 years ago, sent me a message. "I just want you to know I believe you. I saw how they treated you even back then. Amber was always the storm, and you were expected to be the umbrella. That wasn't fair." I stared at that message, reading it over and over until the words blurred. I cried harder at that than I had at anything in the hospital, because someone had seen me, finally, clearly, without me having to explain. Then there was Lana, my coworker who dropped off groceries without asking and left a note on my door that simply said, "Rest, we've got you covered, got you." And Nora, my closest friend since college, who sent a text that read, "You don't owe anyone your survival." That sentence hit like a lighthouse beam cutting through the fog. I didn't owe anyone my strength, my silence, my explanations. And as the days passed, I started to rebuild something I had never thought I deserved: support, on my terms, without conditions, without giving more than I had. I returned to therapy, and for the first time, I didn't talk about my father or Amber to justify their behavior. I talked about myself, my choices, my patterns. I unpacked years of silent suffering and began the slow work of understanding why I had stayed in a family system that thrived on my erasure. One afternoon, my therapist leaned forward and said something that pierced straight through me. "You weren't loved for who you were. You were rewarded for what you gave. That's not love. That's a transaction." I sat there, frozen, the truth of that statement echoing like a scream in a cave. All my life, I had been trying to buy love. With obedience, with patience, with money, with silence. And they had taken every piece I offered without ever offering anything real in return. That wasn't family. That was extraction. That was emotional currency spent with no return. So I stopped trying. I opened a savings account under a new name, one no one knew about. I updated my emergency contacts. I removed my father from everything legal. I blocked Amber and Dad on every platform. It wasn't rage that guided me. It wasn't revenge. It was peace. A quiet, unwavering peace that settled in once I stopped chasing ghosts and started standing in my own presence. The kind of peace that doesn't ask for permission. The kind that doesn't flinch when the door stays closed. It took time. The cast on my leg was replaced with a brace, then a cane, then nothing at all. But the emotional wound, the one left by years of conditional affection, took longer to heal. Still, I noticed the shift. I cooked dinner for myself and didn't feel the need to send leftovers to anyone. I walked in the park alone and didn't feel hollow. I laughed without needing someone to tell me it was okay. And bit by bit, I rebuilt the foundation they had eroded. Not with grand gestures, but with small, deliberate choices that said I exist, I matter, I am enough without their approval. They never apologized. Not once. But they stopped reaching out after Georgia served them the final legal notice reinforcing that the door had been closed. Their absence, once terrifying, became a gift. And in that space, I found something more powerful than closure. I found myself. Months passed. The world outside turned from the pale gray of winter into the cautious bloom of early spring. My leg, once a throbbing map of fractures and bruises, had begun to heal. The cast was long gone, replaced by a brace, then just a cane, and eventually only a faint soreness when I climbed too many stairs or when the rain lingered. But the deeper wounds, the ones no scan could detect, were slower to close. They were not injuries of the body, but of the heart, of the soul, of memory and history and years of being seen only when useful. Those wounds were invisible but omnipresent, like echoes that bounced off everything I touched. And yet even they began to quiet. I no longer cried in the shower. I no longer checked my phone expecting a message that would never come. I no longer rehearsed arguments I would never have, hoping for apologies that would never be spoken. The absence of my father and Amber became a kind of strange relief. There was no more wondering if they would take from me again. No more waiting for the next emotional debt to be collected. I had closed that account, permanently, and in doing so, I had created space. Not just literal space in my home and bank account, but emotional space room to breathe, to rest, to explore who I was when I was not performing strength for others. I began to do small things for myself. I rearranged my living room, painting one wall a soft green that made the light feel warmer. I started journaling again, not to record pain, but to rediscover pleasure. I cooked elaborate meals for no reason other than the joy of flavor. I signed up for a weekend photography class. I sat in silence and did not feel lonely. I felt whole. Every now and then a mutual acquaintance would mention that my father had been asking around, that Amber had made a vague post about betrayal and how some people only come around when they want something and then disappear when it's inconvenient. I didn't respond, not in words, not in defense, because I had learned that defending myself to people committed to misunderstanding me was just another form of begging. And I was done begging. I had begged with my time, my money, my silence, my compliance. And none of it had ever made them see me. So I stopped trying to be seen by those who only looked when I was bleeding. Instead, I focused on the ones who had shown up without needing explanations. Nora continued to call once a week just to talk. Lana invited me to a book club that met in the back of a tiny wine bar. My neighbor, Mrs. Lively, started leaving flowers from her garden on my doorstep every Friday. These small gestures filled me more than years of strained family holidays ever had. I began to understand what love felt like when it was not transactional. It was quiet, consistent, uncomplicated. It didn't demand a performance. It didn't require self-sacrifice. It simply existed. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch sipping tea, Georgia called with a final update. All legal matters were settled. My name was protected. My estate was secured. They had no more access to anything tied to me. "It's done," she said. "You're untethered." That word hit me with a weight I didn't expect. Untethered. No longer bound. No longer responsible for carrying people who had never asked how much the load cost me. I thanked her, hung up, and let the words sink in. Untethered didn't mean floating. It meant free. Free to build new connections rooted in truth, not obligation. Free to rest without guilt. Free to dream without editing myself. I returned to therapy not because I was broken, but because I wanted to stay whole. My therapist smiled during one session and said, "You're no longer surviving your family. You're living without them. There's a difference." I nodded. I knew. I had finally become the version of myself I used to imagine late at night when the house was silent and I was exhausted from saying yes to everyone else. I was no longer the reliable daughter, no longer the financial crutch, no longer the emotional sponge. I was Evelyn, fully, finally, and that was enough. It was a Thursday morning in late May when the final piece of closure arrived, not with drama, not with confrontation, but in the form of a white envelope slid quietly into my mailbox. No return address, but the handwriting was unmistakable. My father's. I stood there for a long moment, keys still in hand, debating whether to open it or toss it straight into the bin. But curiosity, that old stubborn thread, tugged once more. I brought it inside, sat at the kitchen counter, and carefully unfolded the letter. It was short. No apology, no admission. Just a few lines of stiff prose. "I'm sorry things had to get this far. I hope one day you'll see that I was trying to keep the family together. Amber is still struggling. She could really use your help right now. Family is family." That was it. No acknowledgement of what he had done, no mention of the hospital, the voicemail, the legal severance. Just another subtle nudge disguised as concern, another plea wrapped in guilt. I folded the letter slowly, methodically, and slid it into the drawer beside the others, the transfer receipts, the text screenshots, the list of missed birthdays and forgotten achievements. It belonged there not as something to dwell on, but as proof. Not of my pain, but of my choice. Proof that even when handed a final opportunity to take responsibility, He chose deflection. He chose Amber. Again. And I chose peace. I didn't respond. I didn't rage. I didn't even cry. I simply went back to brewing my coffee, letting the morning sun warm my shoulders through the window. That weekend, I drove out to the coast, alone. No agenda. Just me, my camera, a few books, and the open sky. I walked along Cannon Beach with my shoes in hand, toes sinking into the sand, the wind tangling my hair as the waves crashed nearby. I breathed in the salt, the silence to the space. And in that space, I felt the final threads of old loyalty loosen and fall away. Not with anger, but with release. The kind of release that comes when you finally stop hoping for different and accept what is. I was never going to get the father I needed. Amber was never going to become the sister I deserved. But I didn't need them to be different for me to live differently. I only needed to let go. On the drive home, I played music I hadn't listened to in years. Songs I used to love before life became too heavy. I sang along off-key windows down, laughing at nothing. That laughter light and unburdened felt like rebellion. The following week, I hosted a dinner for the first time in my own home. Just 4 people: Nora, Lana, Tessa, and Georgia. We ate pasta I made from scratch, drank wine that was far too expensive for a Thursday, and talked late into the night about everything and nothing. At one point, Georgia raised a glass and said to choosing ourselves. To not being the strong one just because we can be. We clinked glasses. And I felt it deep in my bones, the belonging I had chased for so long, finally found in a room where no one needed me to bleed to feel loved. I went to sleep that night with the windows open and the breeze drifting in a quiet reminder that the world outside was still wide and waiting. I dreamed of a future not built on compensation, but on clarity. A future where I said no without guilt, asked for help without shame, loved without fear of being erased. Weeks passed, then months. I never heard from Amber again. My father sent one more letter in July, a single page of nostalgia, trying to recall happier memories, asking if we could put everything behind us. I read it once and then let it go, not because I didn't care, but because I had finally learned that some things are too expensive to carry even if they come wrapped in sentiment. The past is not a place I owe rent to, and forgiveness is not the same as reconciliation. I forgave him silently in the quiet of my own heart, not for his sake, but for mine. Because I deserved to live free of resentment. Because I didn't want their choices echoing in every corner of my life anymore. The healing didn't come all at once. It came in moments. In making pancakes for myself on a lazy Sunday. In dancing barefoot in my living room just because. In holding a friend's baby and realizing I would never parent the way I had been parented. In laughing until I cried at a bad movie with Nora. In watching the sunrise with a cup of tea and no one else to answer to. I learned to mother myself, to celebrate myself, to see myself. And in doing so, I dismantled the old story, the one where I was only lovable when needed, only valuable when giving. I wrote a new one. In it, I was not the strong daughter or the quiet sister. I was simply Evelyn, whole, flawed, enough. And if there's anyone else out there reading this still waiting for someone to come through, still trying to earn love by being useful, hear this. You do not have to bleed to be worthy. You do not have to shrink to keep others comfortable. You do not have to justify your pain or your boundaries. You are allowed to walk away, to protect your peace, to choose yourself. Because the day you stop begging for love is the day you begin to truly receive it. And you just as you are already enough.